There's something awe-inspiring and fascinating to me about life sciences. To see the progression of life from the primordial soup to what our world looks like now, evolution is essentially chapters in the book of the ecosystem. And yet, there's something I've come to wonder, from folklore to horror films and beyond. When I was a kid, I remember latching on to certain aspects of things that I found scary. Even in the single digits of age, I remember not being afraid of vampires, for example, because of their blood-sucking nature. But the idea that, if someone was bitten, they are transformed forever, cursed to live the rest of their days as an immortal creature of the night. Later on, I would continue to find this particular aspect of biology-themed horror a bit unnerving or frightening. I recall my dad showing me what I consider the top two horror movies of all time, Alien and The Thing. Yeah, real original picks, I know. Both of these tap heavily into the transformative element of horror, using human and animal biology to make their monsters. But then again, you've probably heard of or seen these before, they're very much household names. With that in mind, there are some others I'd like to go over, but not before giving some credit where it's due to Curious Archive, whose video, The Scariest Genre of Science Fiction, is, at least to my knowledge, responsible for coining the term evolutionary horror. I found it extremely relatable when he was covering the subject matters in his video, but I wanted to expand on it myself, both with anecdotal examples and more of a dive on why this genre of body horror may affect someone on a deeply personal level. I've been wanting an excuse to discuss the horror potential of kaiju films, and while there's one in particular that really affected me as a kid that I'll probably talk about another time, there's a more modern example that comes to mind right away. Shin Godzilla isn't the usual fare when it comes to the long-running franchise. The big man himself doesn't start out looking the way we recognize, but instead evolves over the course of the film. While this, in and of itself, isn't explicitly terrifying, there's something about the film's ending that makes it, in my opinion, one of the most bone-chilling film conclusions of all time. In the final shots of the movie, Godzilla, frozen solid, has begun a new stage of evolution, with several humanoid creatures sprouting from his tail. This, and the unsettling humanoid jaws within the tail's tip, are some of the most striking images ever put in a kaiju movie. As evolution revolves around response to stimuli and environment, this take on the Big G is wonderfully put by Andrew Whalen in an article for Player One that I've linked in the description. If committees defeated Godzilla, then Godzilla would become a committee. The last shot of Shin Godzilla depicts Godzilla evolving into its next form, an army of humanoids to match collective power with collective power. Even beyond the movie's conclusion, there are some amazing concept art pieces that were made when determining the direction that this idea would take. Some were even more humanoid than what we got in the final product, and others even bordered on looking angelic or ethereal. Though the themes of the movie are more political in nature, the body horror and spine-tingling final shots cement this movie as a staple in the genre. Another example of this kind of horror in Japanese media is Elfen Lied, an anime and manga series that I used to describe thusly. Well done series, very good, don't recommend it. I've only ever seen the anime, but from my research, a lot of the elements that I'm talking about are also present in the manga. I won't get too stuck on the plot of this one, but more or less the world-building aspect centering around the Diclonius subspecies, an offshoot human species born with two pronounced horns on their heads and unconventional hair colors. It's shades of pink in the anime. Diclonii are only born as females and have the ability to produce invisible arms called vectors. If these vectors touch a human male, they're infected with the vector virus, and any children they have will be born as a Diclonius silpili? I don't know how to pronounce that, which cannot reproduce sexually as only the queen Diclonius is capable of doing so. Throughout the series, questions of whether or not the Diclonii are seeking to wipe out humanity and or if the inverse is true are core components. Nature versus nurture very much at play. Something about the theme of discrimination and social injustice in the series also reminds me of another thing that I hold dear, the X-Men comics. Mostly in the way that people react to mutant kind, and it begs the question, does humanity fear evolution, or does it fear being left behind or phased out? Though it's easy to say that mankind, inherently, may fear being left behind in the evolutionary race, or lose its top of the food chain status, there's also something to be said about the idea of the fear of being irrevocably changed. A story I always go back to is C.M. Kozuman's All Tomorrows. Though the story is more hopeful in tone by the end, with a very positive message, there's no denying the gut-wrenching body horror within. For a quick summary, Humanity in the far future is genetically modified into several different animal species by the Q, masters of genetic engineering. This story's art, to say the least, is downright haunting. I remember the first time I watched a video on this one, seeing the art alongside narration of the story. The first view had me like, this is macabre, but interesting, like very cool stuff all around. And then I got to the section about the Tempters. I was flabbergasted. I looked at this image and seeing all the subtle changes made me legitimately physically retch. The eye, the lip-like area around the beak, but the nose. That damn nose made my brain make the connection that this horrifying cone of flesh used to be a woman with sapience and personality and all that comes with being truly human. Other species in the story are, of course, also very much fucked up, but this one in particular got under my skin. Outside of just the Tempters, I do think there are also some honorable mentions, but I definitely recommend that you read the story for yourself or watch a video on it. Some honorable mentions include the lopsiders or asymmetric people that are essentially just human pancakes straight out of a Baroque painting. Then you have the Mantelopes, which I personally think are the worst outcome out of all of these. Because yeah, it's one thing to be evolved into some fucked up decoration, but it's another to be turned into an antelope and keeping your humanity. After a long period of time, their sadness and their grief just led them to devolve back into simple animals. And then, of course, you have the colonials, which are essentially just carpets of sapient human flesh, which is just so fucked up. And again, the idea of genetically modifying humanity is always a concept that gets horrific very quickly. Splice is a movie that centers its plot around gene splicing and human-animal hybridization, going to some rather uncomfortable places. Honestly, it's a bit hard to watch and it gets into some disturbing sexual moments, especially near the end. The main rundown is that two scientists are working on gene splicing animal and human DNA to grow organisms for medical use. One of the hybrids they create, Dren, ages and evolves rapidly through the course of the movie. At first, she just looks like a little homunculus, but becomes more and more humanoid over time. She has the ability to adapt on the fly, like growing gills, wings, a stinger, and even changing her sex. In nature, this is called sequential hermaphroditism, where an organism is born one sex but can change based on differing factors depending on species. This is most recognizably observed in clownfish and oysters, which are all born as male but can change to female to support reproduction in a process called protandry, and in other fish like gobies, groupers, wrasses, and other species that fall into the category of organisms that are born female but can change to male, or protogeny. This is actually the most common of the two in nature, at least in fish species. This isn't even part of the horror discussion anymore, I just love biology fun facts. Anyways, science lesson over, back to the point of where this is all going. So Dren evolves over the course of the movie, and by the time she reaches an adult stage, things take a bit of a dark, gut-wrenching turn. If sexual content isn't something that works for you, I would honestly skip this one. I don't usually have any issue with explicit shit personally, but there's a scene at the end of the movie that just straight up made my stomach sink. It's Freudian, disturbing, and definitely elicits a reaction. Your mileage will vary.
Life, finds a way.
So I've talked a lot about things that have been released to the masses in one form or another, but there's one thing I've been wanting to dredge up that I learned about many years ago and piqued my curiosity that I don't see talked about very often. Before Chris Pratt showed up on the scene of the franchise,
Koopas!
Jurassic Park 4 was going to be quite the shark jump from the previous 3 movies. Straight up, and I'm being dead serious, the plot was going to be as follows. The new main protagonist was to be a mercenary named Nick Harris, who was sent to Isla Nublar to retrieve that can of dino DNA in a shaving cream container left behind by Newman from Seinfeld. He was going to then be captured and brought to a castle in the Swiss Alps owned by a villain named Baron von Drax, who was using dinosaur DNA to create gene-spliced dinosaur super soldiers. Now, this of course feels much less like Jurassic Park and definitely more like a mixture of James Bond, Metal Gear, and Dino Crisis, which, I mean, it's actually kind of fucking sick, what the hell? Would this have been good? Who's to say? Probably not. It probably would have actually fucking sucked. It probably would have ended up in the Hall of Fame of delicious garbage tier movies, where I'd watch it ironically or because it's so bad it's good or something of that nature. But I will say this. The concept art for this version of the movie, done by Carlos Huante, is actually very visceral and cool, and maybe better served in a horror-centric take on the concept. Except for this guy, he belongs in a Todd McFarlane comic from the 90s. There's a lot of great concepts here. Blending human features with the inhuman is always a great recipe to dive into the horrors of toying with the natural order and playing God. I've waffled on for a bit about some anecdotal experiences with media that's rocked me by way of altered human forms, forced evolution, or the horror that something can outpace humanity and thus doom it forevermore. But at the end of the day, why do I feel this way? By extension, why is this an effective genre of horror? Well, I'm no psychologist, but I've got a few cheesy ideas. One thing I always go back to when I see something malformed, twisted, or otherwise completely unrecognizable from its original form, especially something with human intelligence, is the overwhelming sadness that comes to mind, knowing that what I'm looking at used to be a person with all the bells and whistles that came from their experiences, all ripped away by whatever changed it. I think that the reason why all of these stories, and many others like them, get to the core of our fears is that they gnaw on our sense of control. Being altered, being outpaced, or outright existentially annihilated by things beyond our control, they all disrupt the comfortable but fragile position that humans find themselves in when considering our role in the ecosystem. It's a perfectly understandable reaction, a visceral response to something that, by all means, cannot be stopped or reasoned with. After all, in the survival of the fittest, how would someone feel if their spot at the top of the food chain was suddenly up for grabs? More specifically, in regards to body horror, I also find it reasonable for audiences to have a strong reaction to stories with a showcase of how evolution can tap into our nightmares, preying upon our most primal fears, and giving us this grotesque, helpless feeling as we witness the monsters not being made, but born. In a way, I almost get the feeling that this specific flavor of body horror almost teeters on or straight up embraces cosmic horror in a sort of union between the two. I suppose, in a bittersweet sense, this all goes to show that, in order to feel the tragedy of humanity being lost, we must first know what humanity is in the first place.